Hello and welcome. So glad to see you all here for our next session of our America 250 series. We are going through 250 years of Huntsville and Madison County history. We are up to the Civil War, so I'm glad you could be here today. My name is Kate Monroe, and I am the manager of special collections here at the library. And speaking today is Emily Seibel, the archivist for special collections. Emily has an MLIS and with a concentration in archives and preservation from California State University, San Jose. She interned with NARA, the Historic Huntsville Foundation, and UAH Archives. So she's been working hard in the field, and we're excited to hear from her today. Please hold your questions until the end. We'll have plenty of time for that. Thank you. This is Emily.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. It's nice to see some familiar faces from around the archives. As Kate said, my name's Emily. I'm the archivist for the Special Collections Department. Today, we'll be looking at the Civil War in Madison County. Rascality in Huntsville, spies, scoundrels, and bushwhackers during the American Civil War. This presentation uses the 2025 book, Rascality in Huntsville, 1861 to 1865, The Spies Among Us, by local author and historian Nancy Rohr, as both its primary source and its framework. When we think of the Civil War, we think of hard-fought battles, we think of famous generals and political leaders like Grant, Lee, Lincoln, and we think of a fractured country where brother fought against brother. What we often overlook, however, is the transformative power of the people who operated in the shadows and the fringe. To understand the Civil War in Madison County, you need to know these stories as well. While official military records prioritize organized campaigns and honorable battles, the wartime experience in Madison County was also defined by what Nancy Rohr coins rascality. Rascality is the decentralized, irregular conflict waged by spies, guerrillas, and bushwhackers whose shifting loyalties and unconventional tactics challenged the authority of both North and South and blurred the lines between military necessity and outright lawlessness. But why is it important to view the Civil War from this lens? Simply put, the power of multiple perspectives. When we look at history from different angles, it creates an accurate and balanced understanding of the past. It fosters context, and it helps to construct a complete picture of a complex past. But before we get into the rascality of it all, it's important to have context. The American Civil War lasted between 1861 and 1865. It was a conflict fought between the Northern Union and the Southern Confederacy. It was primarily triggered by long-standing tensions over the institution of slavery and its expansion into new territories. These moral and economic divisions were further intensified by disputes over states' rights versus federal authority and the stark industrial and cultural differences between the two regions. The war ultimately resulted in a Union victory, the abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment, and the preservation of the United States as a single sovereign nation. In 1860, Huntsville was much smaller than it is today. In fact, it consisted of only about 4 square miles, centering around what is now called Courthouse Square. At the onset of the Civil War, Huntsville was a major political and trading hub. The region was comparatively wealthy due to a few different factors: the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, a booming cotton industry, and the fact that it was home to some of the wealthiest individuals in the South, including Leroy Pope, the Clay family, and the Bibb family. The economy was heavily reliant on cotton and supported a population of roughly 3,600. When the Civil War began, the town of Huntsville had 1,980 white residents living there and an almost equal number of Black residents, including 1,654 enslaved individuals and 85 free individuals. Surrounding Madison County had a population of about 26,000. This map is from 1837, slightly earlier than the time period we're discussing, but it offers a good view of what is now downtown Huntsville, from Holmes Avenue to William Street, as it existed in the 19th century. This map, however, is from 1861. Although a bit harder to see, it depicts modern downtown Huntsville in 1861, separated into 4 wards, from what is now Locust Street to Meridian Street. Historically, the sentiment in Huntsville towards secession was much more divided than in the deep south of Alabama. Unlike the southern part of the state, which was heavily dominated by a plantation economy and very much pro-secession, North Alabama had a strong contingent of Unionists. North Alabama had strong economic ties to the North via the Tennessee River and the Memphis and Charleston Railroad. Many local farmers and merchants feared that war would destroy trade vital to the local economy and bring conflict directly to their doorsteps, which eventually it did. When Alabama held its secession convention in January 1861, Madison County's delegates actually voted against immediate secession. They preferred a cooperative approach, where the state would only secede if a collective group of southern states agreed to do so together, or they hoped for a compromise that would keep the Union intact. But that all changed after the events at Fort Sumter. Once the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in 1861 and President Lincoln called for volunteers to suppress the rebellion, attitudes in Huntsville shifted. Like many initially reluctant Southerners, the majority of Huntsville citizens felt like they had the right to defend their state. Local leaders who had previously argued for the Union eventually signed the Ordinance of Secession to maintain regional unity. This quote from Jeremiah Clemens, U.S. Senator from Alabama, who's pictured above, sums up the feeling of Madison County citizens who initially opposed secession. He said, "I am a son of Alabama, her destiny is mine. Calmly and deliberately I walk with you in revolution." Huntsville was actually occupied by the Union at two different points during the Civil War. Huntsville was first captured by Union troops led by General Ormsby M. Mitchell on April 11, 1862 in a surprise maneuver. According to General Mitchell, Huntsville was seized without a fight and without firing a single shot. At the time, most of the men in Huntsville were fighting in Northern Virginia or on the Western Front, leaving Huntsville largely undefended and vulnerable to attack. Huntsville was seen as a strategic prize for the Union due to the critical Memphis and Charleston Railroad. The railroad, and specifically the Eastern Division headquarters that was located in Huntsville, which is now the Huntsville Train Depot, was a critical passage for moving Confederate troops and supplies. By capturing the city, Mitchell effectively cut the Confederacy's most vital east-west railroad artery. Unlike many other southern cities that were largely destroyed by Union forces during the Civil War, such as Atlanta, Jackson, and Charleston, Huntsville was mostly unscathed during Union occupation because of its strategic importance. The first Union occupation of Huntsville lasted only until August 31st, 1862. However, a year later, on July 4th, 1863, Union troops returned and continued their stay in Huntsville until the end of the war in 1865. The Union used local railroad yards and the Huntsville Depot as a logistical base. The depot itself was used as a prison for Confederate soldiers and a hub for moving Union supplies. Instead of cotton, the trains now moved Union troops and heavy artillery. So what was life like in Union-occupied Huntsville? General Mitchell's initial occupation was characterized by a very strict but relatively orderly administration. He utilized the city's resources to maintain his troops while attempting to re-educate the local population on Union loyalty, with little success. He enacted curfews and passes. Movement was strictly controlled. To leave the city or even travel between certain neighborhoods, residents often had to obtain written passes from the Union provost marshal. There was economic hardship and scarcity as well. The war effectively choked the local economy. Since the Union controlled the rails, the cotton trade ground to a halt. Basic goods like salt, sugar, and coffee became nearly impossible to find. Families even resorted to what they called Confederate coffee, made from parched corn, okra seeds, or sweet potatoes. While the city itself was spared from burning, surrounding farms were not so lucky. Both Union and Confederate troops frequently foraged, or maybe seized is a more accurate term, livestock, horses, and grain, leaving many local families on the brink of starvation. High-profile homes in the Twickenham district were commandeered as headquarters for Union officers. For example, the Leroy Pope Mansion served as a headquarters for several generals. Many of the grandest homes in the Twickenham and Old Town districts were seized. If you were a prominent resident, you might have found yourself living in the back rooms or the basement of your own house, while a Union general and his staff moved into your parlor. Homes with Yankee borders, as they were called, were fortunate in some ways because the families were sometimes given money, food, and other goods for their troubles. This image here of the First National Bank, which was then called the Northern Bank of Alabama, it's still standing today in downtown Huntsville. In this image, Union soldiers are hoisting an American flag to show that Huntsville is no longer under the control of the Confederacy. If you'll remember, at this time, the southern states were rebelling and no longer considered the American flag to be their flag. This image is of a Union soldier encampment in downtown Huntsville. Soldiers were camped throughout the city. If you'll notice the empty streets, the Union monitored Huntsville citizens' day-to-day activities. Social events were restricted, and citizens were less free to move around the city. Some Huntsville citizens who were known to support the Confederate government were even put in jail. And a changing social landscape, the contraband camps. As Union troops moved in, hundreds of enslaved people from surrounding plantations fled to Huntsville seeking protection. The Union Army established contraband camps where these individuals lived and worked, marking the beginning of a social shift in the local labor force and population. Divided loyalties. While some families remained staunchly Confederate, others, especially those with business ties to the North, were Unionists. This created deep rifts between neighbors and even within families that lasted decades after the war ended. U.S. colored troops. When the Civil War began, many enslaved Black men left North Alabama to join Union forces. These men were formed into separate regiments known as the United States Colored Troops. 6 regiments were raised from Alabama, 5 of which were comprised mostly of former slaves. The 106th U.S. Colored Troop, which is depicted in this image, this regiment was organized in Decatur in early 1864, but operated throughout the District of North Alabama. They were primarily tasked with garrison duty and protecting the vital rail lines like the Memphis and Charleston Railroad that ran through Huntsville. The word impressment in this context refers to Black Americans who were forced into service during the war. Impressment happened on both the Union and Confederate sides. During occupation, many of the enslaved Black Americans in Huntsville were impressed to work for the Union doing labor, while others were already impressed to work in military service with their Confederate enslavers. When President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, abolishing slavery in the United States, arrangements were made to pay impressed Black Americans for their work. And while this was an important step towards freedom, Black people were still paid less for their work than white people. But now that we have the context, let's think for a second about how we usually talk about the Civil War. What we've been discussing so far is the scene war. It's what we learn about. It's the battles, the infantry charges, the legislative changes, and the proclamations. It's what is documented and remembered. But while that was all happening in the spotlight, there was a second, much grittier war happening in the dark. That is what I call the unseen war. Because a general can draw up the most brilliant strategy on a map, but if a local spy has already slipped those plans to the enemy, the battle may be over before it even starts. So today we aren't talking about the men who sat for portraits. We're talking about the people who operated in the shadows, the spies, the scoundrels, and the bushwhackers of Madison County, whose contribution to the war history almost forgot. All of the following information is from Nancy Rohr's book, Rascality, but where did the information originally come from? The source of the material in Nancy Rohr's book was a small spy notebook found in the Edward Reed Papers collection at the Indiana Historical Society. The information in the notebook was collected and written by different men, but compiled by Union Lieutenant Edward Reed. During the chaotic final quarter of 1864, fearing the valuable contents of the notebook might be lost, or worse, discovered by the enemy, Lieutenant Edward Reed officially took personal possession of it. When he passed, the Indiana Historical Society took possession of his papers, and the slim notebook was found among them. The notebook revealed lists of names of specific people in Madison County in the years 1862 to 1863, accompanied by brief passages reporting each person's positions and actions during the war. Who recorded the notebooks? They were spies for the Union cause with access to classified information about civilian activities in a war-torn county. And while the spy notebook is the centerpiece of information, supplementary material retrieved from the National Archives was also used. This consists of the daily military and personal correspondence of General Ormsby Mitchell, commanding Union officer in occupied Huntsville. The Union and the Confederacy both maintained vast networks of informants. Very few official records of Civil War espionage exist, as is the nature of the job. Because of that, there is no telling how many informants actually existed for either side. What is known is that 70 different people received cash payments from the U.S. Secret Service just at Corinth, Mississippi. Corinth being one of the most vital strategic points in the South due to it containing the intersection of the Memphis-Charleston Railroad and the Mobile, Ohio Railroad. So at least 70 informants operated in and around Corinth alone. It's estimated that thousands of them existed throughout the war. According to Nancy Rohr, all spies, couriers, or anyone accused of being a spy might expect, if caught, to be summarily tried and executed without any necessary paperwork being filed. There are several high-profile spies whose work came to light in the years after the war, some of whom we will discuss today. And there are also more covert spies who we know very little about, such as Miss Mary Malone. According to the notebook, Miss Mary Malone was paid $800, $26,000 by today's standards, by the federal government to take 3 trips to Corinth, Mississippi. What was she doing there? What information did she have that was worth $26,000 to the federal government? We may never know. Also of note, Mr. Joseph W. Palmer. Mr. Palmer made several trips for the U.S. Secret Service between 1862 and 1863. He was paid $100 to scout as far away as Savannah, Cherokee, Eastport, Pikeville, and Bay Springs. One trip brought Mr. Palmer to Huntsville, for which he was paid $300 upon completion. Not much is known about his expeditions other than that they were necessary to the public service. Necessary enough to the public service that the federal government paid him for it. But let's discuss those spies that we have a little bit more information on. Edward F. Reed. The spy notebook in question belonged to Edward Reed. Born in Scotland, Edward immigrated to the U.S. at some point prior to the Civil War. Reed was an avowed abolitionist. In 1862, he enlisted in Madison, Indiana, as a private in the 3rd Indiana Cavalry. In 1864, he was moved to Huntsville, Alabama, where he became acting assistant adjutant general of the Post District of Huntsville and chief administrative officer in charge of maintaining records. This position was the perfect place for him to do undercover work behind Confederate lines and to keep detailed notes about various Huntsvillians. Among the notable items is a notebook kept by Reed from 1864 to 1865 containing information from spies in Madison County. The notebook separated inhabitants of Huntsville into categories such as guerrillas, gave aid to guerrillas, entitled to protection, and good Union men. According to Nancy Rohr, it is likely that the notebook existed in several different sections at that time, and Reed compiled and assembled the records in preparation for the September attack on Fort Taylor. It was crucial that this notebook remained protected from the enemy if Huntsville surrendered. Reed's meticulous collection and care of records in his position as AAAG is the sole reason this notebook exists. This is the only known picture of him, courtesy of Monmouth College. After the war, Reed moved to Illinois, got a job as a professor of ancient languages at Monmouth College. His compiling of intel about citizens of Huntsville makes Edward F. Reed a spy. Emile Boulier. This image from Nancy Rohr's book, I don't know where it was found. I was not able to find any other photographs of Mr. Boulier. Emile is one of the spies who reported on Huntsvillians, whose observations are recorded in the infamous spy notebook. Emile was born in France in 1832 and arrived in the U.S. at age 10 with his parents and his older brother. It is unclear exactly when he became a spy, but a later statement showed him in Huntsville in 1862, when the town was under Confederate control. His assignment, according to historian Thomas Dyer, was to assess the military and civilian conditions in a large swath of the South from Mobile to Richmond. He was successful in his mission. In less than 3½ months, he traveled almost constantly, straight into the heart of the Confederacy, and made keen observations of Confederate movements and armaments. All told, he traveled to Montgomery, Selma, Atlanta 3 times, twice to Mobile, and made stops at Richmond, Nassau Island, and finally, New York. Boulier stayed in Huntsville for a time where he reported on secessionists and even on Union soldiers who were not acting right. Boulier would later submit an extensive report to the Union about the goings-on in Huntsville. His espionage certainly classifies Mr. Boulier as a spy. The Larkhams. J. Howard Larkham and his wife, she is unnamed, only referred to as Mrs. Larkham. There are no known photographs of the Larkhams. Mr. Larkham was born in New Jersey and spent many years in Pennsylvania before moving to Huntsville prior to the Civil War. It is reported that he and his wife were known notorious Lincolnites. They were appointed as chief telegraph operators in the city of Huntsville during the Civil War. The telegraph was an essential communication line used to discuss railroad and troop movements. The Civil War was the first major conflict fought in the U.S. that extensively used the telegraph. The telegraph revolutionized wartime leadership. It allowed Lincoln to have real-time, long-distance communication with Union generals and other military leaders. It also offered the Union a big strategic advantage over the Confederacy, who had a much smaller and underdeveloped network. Keeping that context in mind, on the evening of April 10, 1862, Mrs. Larkham received a handwritten telegraph from a Mr. Jonathan Webb that the Federals, or the Union Army, were 8 miles away and advancing toward Huntsville. It was to be telegraphed for immediate action. Mrs. Larkham received the message, but did not send it. The Union Army would capture Huntsville the very next day. Over the course of the Larkham's tenure as chief telegraph operators, they appear to have failed to send several other telegrams. If that wasn't proof enough, 25 years after the Civil War, a man named A.A. Gildersleeve wrote a column for a Washington newspaper about the capture of Huntsville that seems to implicate the Larkhams. Gildersleeve wrote about a man, identified only as OLK, described as a native of Philadelphia and the superintendent of the Huntsville Telegraph, both descriptions which fit Mr. Larkham. According to Gildersleeve, a scout informed Larkham that Union troops were seen in Meridianville. Upon hearing this, Larkham, quote, complimented the scout on his service and offered him a comfortable bed in the upstairs depot of the bunkhouse for the night, end quote. The information went no further. Larkham continued to allow Confederate trains from the west to arrive in the Huntsville train yard. He then promptly locked up the office, went home, and told his wife they would wake up in the United States in the morning. And so they did. During the war, the Larkhams moved north, and Mr. Larkham registered for the Union draft in Washington, D.C. Their assistance to the Union Army proves the Larkhams were, in fact, spies. Rebels in Huntsville. The spy notebook written by Boulier and compiled by Reed also kept a log of people who Boulier termed rebels. Boulier described these people as bitter secessionists and kept a list of names of all those who Boulier considered a potential threat in need of watching. Charges range from having children in the rebel army, to being insulting to Unionists, to being a spy themselves. Here are just a few of those such rebels. James Neely. This is what Boulier had to say on Mr. Neely. 54-year-old pump maker, arrived in Huntsville in 1830. By 1850, had a sizable real estate holdings valued at $3,000. Originally from Virginia, he and his wife resided on Green Street near Meridianville Road with their 6 children. What did he do to get deemed by Emile as a bitter secessionist? He went to the rebels and reported a list of Union families who fled Huntsville for safety in the fall of 1863. James Neely, bitter secessionist. William Ackland Sr., grandson of town forefather John Hunt, lawyer and prominent man in the community. He served in the Alabama House of Representatives 4 times and once in the state Senate. Ackland advocated for the removal of loyalists from their homes and argued that Unionists and their families should be removed from Huntsville during its occupation by the Confederates. Boulier writes that he has always been very offensive to Unionists. In 1865, Mr. Ackland applied for a pardon after the war, and in 1870 was listed as a farmer. William Ackland Sr., bitter secessionist. Anderson Burrow. Boulier writes, Anderson Burrow keeps a billiard saloon in the Huntsville Hotel. He is a very boisterous secessionist when the rebels are about, is very insulting and threatening to Unionists, but is sycophantic when the Federals are about. Anderson Burrow, I'm sorry to say, spineless. Dr. Amatus Robbins Burritt, father of William Henry Burritt, notable doctor who built Burritt on the Mountain. He was a homeopathic physician from Illinois. Boulier writes, Dr. Burritt, very offensive to Unionists, sneering amongst other expressions used by him during the month of May. He said the Federals' rule of Huntsville was oppressive and repugnant to him, and the blue coat so offensive to his eyes that if the Federals remained a little longer, he would die for want of breath. Dr. Amatus Robbins Burritt, Boulier dubbed him offensive to Unionists, but I have also dubbed him a drama queen. And for our final group, the Confederate guerrilla fighters, also known as bushwhackers. During the American Civil War, bushwhackers were pro-Confederate guerrilla fighters who operated primarily in rural contested areas like Missouri, Arkansas, and the Appalachian Mountains. Unlike regular soldiers, they fought outside formal military command structure. They used hit-and-run tactics and ambushes from concealed positions, hence the name bushwhacker. In April of 1862, the Confederacy ratified the Partisan Ranger Act, allowing irregular or guerrilla groups military status, or independent companies, as they were sometimes called. They armed themselves and would be paid for subsistence and forage. This allowed the men to slip in and out of the war at their convenience, but it resulted in unstructured and violent attacks on citizens as well as the enemy. The act was repealed in 1864, too late to save many soldiers, civilians, or their possessions. Joel Cunningham. Joel Cunningham led a large group of bushwhackers in Madison County. To set the scene, by mid-1863, some men were more determined than ever to avoid service in the Confederate Army. The mountains of North Alabama now contained thousands of men in hiding. Some formed bands to pillage and murder, spreading fear among the unprotected elderly, women, and children. Human life, it seems, had become cheap. The Union tried desperately to restore civil order. The Union ordered home guard companies of all male residents age 14 and over for the purpose of protecting communities by exterminating bushwhackers, horse thieves, and other lawless men. Joel Cunningham was originally from Fayetteville, Tennessee. He enlisted for the Confederate Army just a few months after the Civil War began, but was discharged due to an unspecified disability. He re-enlisted in 1864 after federal troops burned down his home and the home of his brother Peter. He and Peter became active guerrilla fighters under the Partisan Rangers Act. At first, his gang of bushwhackers was described as numbering about 20, but later Joel was described as being in charge of a gang of over 75 or 100 bushwhackers. In February of 1865, Union Major General Robert H. Gilroy created a list of 14 bushwhackers, some of whom were ordered to be hanged and their homes to burn. Among the names was that of Joel Cunningham, stating, "He is the leader of a gang of bushwhackers 75 to 100 strong, and with one simple order, kill." February 1865, he and his brother Peter were captured near Fayetteville in order to be executed, but they escaped with the help of other rebel families and managed to evade Union forces by hiding out for some time. Eventually, Cunningham died in 1873 while engaged in a deer hunt in Walker County, Alabama. Joel Cunningham, bushwhacker. Frank Gurley. For our final rascal spotlight, Captain Frank B. Gurley. Son of John Gurley, the pioneer settler who established homesteads in the area as early as 1830, Frank Gurley was a prominent Confederate officer and a notorious cavalry captain who led groups of so-called partisan rangers or bushwhackers. He joined the Confederacy at age 27 as a private and became elected captain later on. He was widely known for a notable incident. Gurley gave his account later of an incident occurring in August of 1862 near Maysville, in which a small group of his men, comprised entirely of partisan rangers, shot and wounded an unidentified soldier assumed to be part of a Union cavalry unit. The victim turned out to be the very popular Ohio officer, General Robert McCook, a Union general, who they did not recognize as a senior officer. He was taken to the nearby home of widow Jane Word, who tended to him as best she could. He reportedly did not blame Gurley for the incident. Immediately after his death, however, McCook's Ohio troops rode with rage and burned down nearby houses, including that of Miss Word, killing livestock and at least one civilian. McCook was killed while defenseless and traveling in an ambulance using guerrilla tactics, as in not killed in formal battle, but in a skirmish with partisans, which the North viewed as cold-blooded murder rather than legitimate battlefield casualty. Frank Gurley survived the war and in the 1890s donated 1 square mile of land that would become the current town of Gurley, Alabama. Frank Gurley, leader of bushwhackers. And to recap, today we've discussed the American Civil War on a broad scale, the Civil War in Huntsville and Madison County, how it impacted and shaped the region and specific individuals within Madison County, who shaped the war effort for both the Union and the Confederacy. I certainly found it interesting, and I had a lot of fun reading Nancy Rohr's book. I hope y'all enjoyed hearing me talk about it. Are there any questions? Yes.
Do we know where the contraband camps were here in Huntsville?
Ooh, I do not know where they were particularly. Let's see. Yeah, I'm afraid I do not. I can look into that later, then I can let you know.
One of my great grandfathers was fighting with the 25th Iowa Infantry, and I read a diary of one of the soldiers in that unit, and they were in this area, and this particular person ended up getting sick. I think somewhere up near Stevenson, and came here to Huntsville, was sent here to Huntsville. This was a large camp for recovering Union soldiers. And he talked about going out to a contraband camp and doing some things out there. And that was the first I had heard any reference to a contraband camp. Area.
Well, Kate, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I always interpreted the term contraband camp as referring more so to the people themselves rather than a specific location. I would imagine that because the Union was in Madison County at that time, using a lot of different buildings in the area, having taken them over, that they were more of a mobile unit. But I could be wrong about that.
He talked about going out to the camp to provide guard duty,
Mhm.
and made reference to the person who was in charge of the camp that's out there. I kind of have a feeling it's, as you could they go up over 72, over the mountains. I think it might have been somewhere in that area.
Mhm.
But I think that needs further exploration because we really haven't really talked very much about that.
It's certainly very possible. Yep. Yes.
Governor Reuben Chapman's estate was one of the locations. One of the.
Oh, okay. Did you hear that in the back? She said, what was it?
Governor Reuben Chapman's estate, which was occupied. of course.
Okay.
That was the.
She said Governor Reuben Chapman's estate was one of the locations of a contraband camp. Yes.
One comment, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all slaves in the United States. It freed slaves in the Confederacy only, not in the border states, not in.
Okay. Thank you for giving me that context. Yes, and as we know, a lot of slaves were not actually freed until later, hence the need for the Juneteenth holiday until word got out. So yes, you're definitely right about that. Yes.
I'm just curious, I think you said Joel Cunningham had died in Walker County. I'm from Carbon Hill, so I was not expecting to see Carbon Hill on the slide. I just wondered if you knew where in the county he died or where that happened.
I do not know where. It had just specified Walker County, Alabama, and I think, let's see.
Kind of interesting what he was doing down there.
Yes, I think he was the one who died in a deer hunt. Yes. But I don't know the exact location, I'm afraid.
I just wondered like if he was living down there or, yeah, I'm gonna have to look into that.
I'm not sure on his specific movements. Yes.
Wasn't General Morgan, whose house is on Franklin, big giant house? Wasn't he like a guerrilla leader, committed all kinds of atrocities?
Morgan. The name is not familiar.
I think it's Morgan.
He was not in the book, at least.
The big house. It's got a big, Confederate, historical sign in front of the house. Conveniently forgets the guerrilla action.
It is certainly possible.
House wasn't that fancy when he was born here, and he only lived here 8 months. They had to leave town because his uncles kept getting in fights of citizens, and so they went off to his father, and he went off later with his father-in-law's estate in Lexington. He did not do anything in Madison County. He was in Tennessee.
That's fine.
Yes. Were there any other questions? Yes.
What about the story of Shadrach Golden from out Newmarket, Hurricane Valley? Have you ever heard that?
I have not. So there are a lot of things that were left out of this presentation, but I was basing this presentation only on what was included within Nancy Rohr's book. So I'm sure there's many things that I didn't touch on and many other stories that are worth exploring. So that one I'm not familiar with, but I'm excited to learn about it.
Because since he stands for the Union, and so his rebel neighbors take him out and shoot him. And so they just up his body in a cave, lots of caves up there. And when the Union troops came back in just a few weeks later, they made the local rebels, and probably their wives, because the men were out hiding, bring the body back up, and the finest monument in that cemetery.
The Bragg Cemetery, that's the tallest monument in Bragg Cemetery.
He followed the Constitution's misspelled.
They had good intentions. Yes.
This lady back here is Miss Rohr.
Yes.
She is, yes. Miss Nancy Rohr is in the building. She wanted to remain incognito, so I didn't out her.
Exciting for me, who just gathered things. I didn't really write. I gathered and put them together, but someone's reading. It's really neat, and you all should be doing the same. I know you are. And the stories here abound, and with all the help at the archives, what could you ask?
Yes.
So I'm a part of the Civil War Roundtable that meets once a month. If there's more information on John Hunt Morgan, folks want, our September evening is going to be all on John Hunt Morgan. Folks are coming down from the video up in Tennessee, and they support that effort. And if you're interested, that'll be an evening. Doesn't cost anything, and it's at the Elks Lodge.
No, thank you for letting us know.
And the roundtable meets every month, except
Okay.
December.
Okay.
The presentation's like this.
Okay.
Second Thursday.
Second Thursday. Okay.
But you can stop over and we'll give you the information.
Thank you very much. If there are no other questions, then we will wrap up.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Emily, for the hard work. Like I said, we could talk about